I feel a special connection to the comic strip figure Charlie Brown. My parents sometimes sound like his. My head is unusually large, see, and I tend to walk like him, like this. Charlie wasn't your regular comic strip figure. I mean, he fretted over everything and openly carried his grief. He was like a modern day Hamlet. We could call him Charlamlet, or better yet, Ham Larley. At the age of 8, Charlie might have had a better understanding of how to deal with grief than the rest of us. Simply stated, we do not know how to deal with grief. In fact, we are so ill equipped, argues Sarah Chavez, executive director of the Good Death Project, that we are actually a grief illiterate society. Today, especially, our struggle is unique. Claire Bidwell Smith, author of Anxiety, The Missing Stage of Grief, explains that over the past year, we have all lost something. She points out that we typically aren't able to grieve until we feel safe. So, right now, as things are opening up and stabilizing, more people are being confronted by their loss. And considering our track record with grief, we could be facing major societal impacts. A September issue of Fortune magazine even calls grief our economy's highest risk factor. Now, just as the Charlie Brown comic strips were in 4 frames, let's take a look at our grief illiteracy in 4 parts. Our problem with first, reading grief. Next, responding to it. Third, the implications from all of this. And finally, some solution steps to help us kick some sense into our grief dilemma. Besides his thinning hairline, Charlie Brown was best known for his signature line, "Good grief." He said it all the time. The creator, Charles Schulz, chose this phrase as a euphemism for the term "good God," which some saw as offensive. The expression "good grief" was like, "Great Scott!" But of course, we don't see grief as good, and Scott, which is the name of my dad, is not that great. He's just good enough. Much like the expression can be confusing, we can also be confused when it comes to reading grief. Kenneth Thoka, professor of psychology at the College of New Rochelle, states that there are so many forms of it that go unacknowledged, largely because we usually define grief only within the context of death. Whether it's the loss of a job, the death of a pet, a divorce, or even when a relationship ends. He calls this disenfranchised grief because it's not considered a socially acceptable form of loss. Even more disturbing is how often we lump grief in with depression. Yet, according to the Handbook of Social Justice in Loss and Grief, there is a significant difference between the two. Grief is a natural suffering in response to loss, while depression is a clinical diagnosis that in many cases requires medical treatment. Grief can certainly magnify depression, and for some, professional treatment is absolutely necessary. But, as Donna Sherman, director of the Dougy Center for Grieving Children, states, we have to be very careful that we do not universally read a broken heart as a disorder with a convenient treatment or timeline. One of the common scenes in the Peanuts comic strip shows Lucy selling emotional support in her psychiatric help booth. Her most frequent customer, Charlie, comes to her feeling a little low. And her response, "Snap out of it! 5 cents, please." Though funny, it does highlight the way that Lucy doesn't really know how to handle Charlie's grief, much in the same way that we don't understand how to respond to it. Why? Well, in a 2019 Guardian article, Vanessa Billy writes, "Our society does not cope with the idea of death. We fear it, and because we fear it, we ignore it." Consider the messaging we use with our children. We tell them, don't feel bad when they have hardships, or when they experience painful feelings of losing a toy or a pet. We are likely to say something like, "It's okay, We'll just get you a new one. Even as adults, we frequently tell our loved ones that the best way to deal with their grief is to stay busy. That's the expectation. In fact, a study completed by the Society of Human Resources in 2016 found that a company's average bereavement leave in the US after the death of a child or a spouse is 2 to 4 days. Not a matter of months or weeks, but days and hours. That's the way we treat grief. When I was 5, I found a dead butterfly and I carried it to my grandma. I am not exaggerating when I tell you that we spent almost 4 hours planning and holding a memorial for that dead butterfly. She was very tolerant. But today, I'm carrying something new. My grandma has dementia. Grief researchers at Berkeley categorize this type of loss as ambiguous grief. It happens when there's no clear moment of death. Was it the first time Grandma forgot her butterfly story? The first time she lost my name? The first time she will no longer recognize me? Or the last time she will draw her breath? Truthfully, it doesn't matter, because it is all just loss. And this loss isn't just carried in our heads and our hearts, it's in our bodies. Mary O'Connor, professor at the University of Arizona, found that the impact was so significant for complicated grievers that they actually have a higher risk of cardiovascular problems than someone who smokes. We have created this dangerous mix of grief and silence where we typically tiptoe around, ignore, or become confused by those in pain. As one griever expressed after losing her nephew in a July 2020 issue of Desert News, if I were in a full body cast, I am certain we would have a conversation about that. But this conversation just seems to be off limits. To experience grief is awful. To deny that it exists is even worse. And to have to do it alone is just unbearable. Like Charlie Brown, his creator Charles Schulz knew love, but he also knew grief. At the age of 19, his mother died, and he would go on to carry this grief with him for the rest of his life. Like his work, his life was rich with both the laughter and loss of living. So, how do we get there? How do we get better at reading and responding to our own grief and that of our loved ones? Well, grief researchers at the Utrecht University in the Netherlands proposed the dual processing model. This model identifies the need to both feel the loss and escape it at times, using avoidant coping mechanisms such as taking a walk, cooking, or enjoying a lunch outside. Different from keeping busy or moving on, they suggest hitting pause, allowing the spirit to catch its breath. Becoming more literate in our grief will also mean that we will need to learn the language of loss. As Megan Devine says in her book, "It's okay that you're not okay." Avoid comparing their grief experiences to your own or trying to be a cheerleader. Instead, be present, mirror their experience, and give advice only with their consent. Lastly, know that things will not always be so hard, but they will never be the same. Nancy Burns, author of The Rush to End Grief, explains the tremendous societal pressure for us to bring closure to our grief. She writes that for some of us, there is no closure, just love. That with pain and loss comes resilience. And the residue of resilience is hope. And maybe that is our good grief.